कुञ्जजीको बारेमा छोटकरी यहाँ भन्यो भने चाहिँ उहाँले युनिभर्सिटी अफ अक्सफोर्डबाट इन्भाइरोमेन्टल चेन्ज एन्ड म्यानेजमेन्टमा एमफिल गर्नुभएको छ यो र उहाँले एमएससी टाटा इन्स्टिच्युट अफ सोसियल साइन्स बम्बे हो मुम्बईबाट नेचुरल रिसोर्समा चाहिँ एमए गर्नुभएको छ उहाँ चाहिँ अहिले साउथ एसिया इन्स्टिच्युट अफ एडभान्स स्टडिजमा अनुसन्धानरत हुनुहुन्छ कार्यक्रम सुरु गर्नुभन्दा अगाडि एक चरणको परिचय गरौँ म चाहिँ देवेन्द्र उप्रेती म यहीँ काम गर्छु
नमस्ते म चाहिँ अमिश मुन्नु हाम्रो राइटर
म चाहिँ सुशान्त म रिसर्च गर्छु
Hi, I'm Sandra. I'm a film producer from India.
Hello, I'm Dia. I'm a student.
Hi, I'm Katya. I'm a PhD student in urban planning, and I've also been working with Lubrak on urban planning.
मेरो नाम प्रत्युष हो त म इतोपाइमा काम
Giacomo, research environmental engineering.
Alicia, researcher, education and development worker.
Namaste, my name is Aitb. I'm a student.
Namaste, I'm Southasia, Nepal, and I'm climate change and sustainable tourism enthusiast.
Sanjira Muktan, Martin Southasia.
Devraj Omage.
I'm Rasan Kharel. I'm currently studying in Kunja engineering.
कुञ्जजीले सुरुमा 40 मिनट जति आफ्नो प्रस्तुति राख्नुहुन्छ त्यस पछाडि हामी खुला छलफल दिन्छ
Thank you everyone for being here and thank you Devinji for giving me this opportunity to present my research. So today I'll be talking about grounded experiences of loss in flood context, which critiques conventional loss and damage assessments. The aim of the presentation is to highlight one among many other ways to engage with and understand climate-induced losses in the Himalayas in an emerging loss and damage discourse in the country, particularly on non-economic and intangible aspects. So the presentation therefore aims to highlight invisible loss, its implication and trade-offs people make to prevent intolerable loss, and to highlight the prevalent power dynamics that shapes what is deemed as intolerable or acceptable loss. I like beginning with this short piece, which I believe provides a good insight into invisible loss. The villages of Lubrak and Kagbeni look radically different than before. Rivers have left a trail of debris, altering the landscape and memories it held for its people. Homes under rubble, ancient trees uprooted, fields that once fed generations lay buried. How does one account for the symbolic and effective loss of culture and place, the sense of belonging, personal and collective notions of identity, and ways of knowing and making sense of the world? In one such conversation, a lama shared this quote about 2021 floods in Lubrak. Such descriptions of the river are not uncommon in Nepal, and they describe it to be both boon and a bane. More importantly, it highlights an aspect of how people live and interpret changes in their landscape. And we were having this conversation over here, overlooking the landscape, and so I would like to bring your attention to the base of the village, which looked like this a decade ago. You might be able to notice that the fields and the trees have disappeared. Similarly, these are before and after flood images of Lubrak that shows disappearance of the same areas. I don't know if you look closely on that side, you might be able to see a line of gabbing water. Similarly, this is for Kagbeni. And it is said that in both cases, it was landslide-induced adverse flood. Heavy rainfall and higher elevations induced landslides blocking the river until it breached. In Kagbeni's case, the last block happened under the bridge. If you notice that bridge over there, that's where the last block happened. And the locals said that it took around 8 years to build the bridge. It was operable for a month, and before the flood took away. This is what Kagbeni looked like before the floods. So you can see the whole infrastructure around pilgrimage, the ghat, the temple, and the bridges. And this is what Kagbeni looks like now. So to situate the research, of course, climate change is an increasing concern in the Himalaya with a range of visible impacts. But climate change impacts do not occur in isolation. Development pursuits of the state, land use change, rampant infrastructure development, and resource extraction in an ecologically sensitive region has accentuated climate impacts and resulted in disproportionate impacts of communities and regions. This has also been framed as the new Himalayan crisis, where poverty remains and environmental vulnerabilities have increased. There's been significant human migration. Foreign aid has been counterproductive, and blueprint development planning has been dysfunctional. So, increasing frequency of disasters in Nepal has led to an emerging loss and damage discourse. Loss and damage primarily focuses on economic impacts of these climate-induced disasters. Invisible loss herein has been a re-emergent framework for intangible dimensions, but has been subsumed under non-economic loss. The distinction between economic and non-economic loss was made prominent by a technical report in core-periphery in Lubrak, where non-economic was framed against economic loss. So if economic loss refers to loss of resources, goods and services commonly traded in the market, non-economic loss were the remainder of the items. This is problematic because it points to market-based conceptualization that reduces loss to a simplistic binary of economic and non-economic. It is indicative of technocratic approaches rooted in positivist climate science and excludes deeply embedded values, relationships, and cultures affected by climate change. So, invisible loss refers to the non-material and intangible forms of harm that are difficult to observe, quantify, or acknowledge within policy frameworks, but have profound implications for individuals and communities. It incorporates multifaceted dimensions such as psychological, emotional, social, and cultural, which are essential to community identity and resilience. And invisible loss as a concept is more attuned to the prevalent power dynamics through the notion of visibility. So in this framing, if adaptation refers to protection of things that people value, then adaptation point is a point beyond which, adaptation limit is a point beyond which people fail to protect things of value. So intolerable loss in this sense refers to those which are fundamentally threatening to private or social norms despite of adaptive action. Tolerable loss are those which requires adaptive action to keep risk at a bearable level. And acceptable loss are those so low that further adaptive action is no longer justified. So my research was premised on these questions. However, I won't be talking about gender aspects in this presentation. But what are invisible loss relating to floods in Lubrak and Kagbeni, and how do they vary across gender and between settlements? And what are the value trade-offs that people engage in to prevent intolerable loss? So in the literature, invisible and non-economic conceptually seems different, but in practice is synonymous. Non-economic loss refers to non-tradable items in the market, whereas invisible loss is based on a notion of visibility. But both have referred to intangible, non-physical dimensions of loss in these following categories. So this is like a representative depiction of how non-economic, invisible, and intangible dimensions have been conceptualized by different peoples. The first three conceptualizations are early conceptualizations of non-economic loss, followed by the other two, which represent later conceptualizations, and the last two on invisible and intangible dimensions. This is to indicate significant overlaps in the concept. Both invisible and non-economic advance the notion of invisibility, where non-economic is said to be unnoticed and invisible is said to be unrecognized. However, both are absent from mainstream loss and damage frameworks. But I believe invisible loss is a more nuanced but an underdeveloped concept in climate change literature. In her seminal work on First Nations in North America, Nancy Turner highlights loss experiences of community as a result of colonial extractive practices. Building on this and other key work, I developed a nexus framing to indicate how such intangible aspects are often inseparable from each other. So some important definitions to go through. Emotional and psychological nexus relate to fear, grief, trauma, anxiety, and depression, all of which have long-term implications for individuals and collective well-being. Loss of self-determination refers to disempowerment and loss of agency to control the outcomes of their lives. Order in the world refers to knowing that life unfolds in familiar ways. Sense of place, culture, and identity nexus refers to notions of place, culture, and identity, how they're deeply entwined, where attachment to land, cultural practices, and traditional knowledge play a central role in community cohesion and resilience. Sense of place refers to emotional and psychological attachments people hold with place. Culture refers to shared practices, customs, and narratives that form a community. And identity are personal and collective notions of self that is constructed through culture and attachment to place. So invisible loss implications therefore reflect deep emotional disconnection as landscape and cultural environments are no longer familiar. Loss of cultural practices or histories, intergenerational knowledge transfer, and loss of identity as it is formed through place-based cultures, and so on. Social fabric refers to the network of relationships, bonds between people, between individual families and community members that foster resilience through collective action. Disasters often weaken such ties through displacement, which leads to feelings of isolation, increased vulnerability, and psychological distress, making recovery more challenging. Indirect economic loss and loss opportunities refer to long-term, less immediate consequences of an event and the inability to capitalize on potential future gains. A flood-displaced community can be affected by disruptions to the agricultural cycle, tourism, or local markets, which can have a long-standing effect on income generation. Mobility refers to one's freedom to move freely or to remain in one's territory, which might be forced or restricted during times of disaster. And displacement of people from homes could lead to loss of identity, cultural practices, continuity, and social cohesion. These in the literature have been found to have a disproportionate impact on women. So the current loss and damage assessments have been critiqued for their preference for quantification. They rely on predefined typologies that undermine infinite or thousands of ways of experiencing loss that are contingent upon people's values, worldviews, and beliefs. And it relies on expert value judgments that risk commensurating the incommensurable. So economic and non-economic binary often fails to reflect actual experiences of loss on the ground, as losses do not adhere to this binary. And quantitative assessments have been blind to aspects of power and trade-offs between individual groups, institutions, that influences whose losses are considered and whose losses are deemed acceptable. So, value-based approach to invisible loss is an emerging methodology where loss is understood as when people are dispossessed of things that they value, which are incommensurate. It opens to subjective and situated interpretations and relies on people's perception of values at stake from climate change. Decisions about what is to be lost and what is to be protected involves a trade-off, which rarely happens in a power vacuum. Therefore, a value-based approach not only questions whose value counts, but who decides what counts. Knowing intolerable loss for different communities is essential for delivering effective and fair adaptation. So, combining value-based approach with plural climate studies framework for the Himalayas, where Chakraborty at I developed a hybrid framework, which was rooted on ontological and epistemological pluralism. And that begins with what do people value in the places they live. This prioritizes place-based experiences of socio-ecological change, acknowledging power differentials embedded across scales and subjectivities. For Nepal, this refers to the process of Nepalization, where plural identities have been assimilated through imposition of language, culture, and religion. Religious and spiritual traditions, which are deeply tied to the landscape, where climate change is also seen as a moral breakdown of relationships between human and the non-human world. Indigenous and local climate knowledge, which are found to be consistent with scientific findings, and erosion of such knowledge has challenged people's sense of place, culture, and identity. Intersectional aspects of gender, caste, and socio-economic status. But scholars have also pointed how these aspects have transformed in current context that has enabled social mobility for some. And core and periphery dynamics of uneven development, where peripheral areas often bear disproportionate burden of climate change, whereas core areas face emerging challenges due to modernization and urbanization. So this is the hybrid framework that I developed based on these insights. And I, for the time being, had understood that this could be a nuanced approach to understanding loss in the Himalayas. The most significant aspect of the research was questioning my own understanding of climate change. Climate is one among many other things that is changing. Therefore, my orientation focused on how do people understand change in their lives and where does climate fit in those. So it was conducted in 2 phases with preliminary insight, which shaped the questionnaire. And I took a comparative case study to show core and periphery dynamics. And the use of first-person narratives have been used to highlight subjective and situated worldviews of people. So Lubrak was more or less a homogeneous community where most people believed in one, whereas Kagbeni was more diverse in terms of ethnicity, religion, as well as occupation. So key limitations for my research was that Mustang, as you might know, is a research saturated area. Women were often unwilling to speak, saying, and of course, 1 month of field work is insufficient for ethnographic study. And I shared a Nepali identity with the people, but Mustang is ethnically a Tibetan region. Mustang Himal Parigo Jillari. Such distant Nepali imaginations of Mustang have questioned the affiliation of its people, rooted in history of Mustang, but for interest of time, I won't be getting into it. But in climate change context, it's been predicted that Mustang will face 12% increment in precipitation, which is the highest in the country, with a decreasing trend of winter snowfall. And in 2021, pre-monsoon rainfall was 103% higher than the normal average of last 6 years. This was 152 millimeter compared to 70 millimeter. Between June 12th and June 16th in 2021, 142 millimeter rainfall had occurred in Mustang. And that's when the flood came in Lubrak. Whereas in Kagbeni, 2 landslides had occurred in higher elevations in July 2023, and the floods had come in the month of August. These pictures try to indicate, the patterns of uneven development. On the left, as you can see, it's the famous Yagrawals in Kagbeni, and below is the road, smooth pitch road to Muklinath. Whereas on the other side, you can see the settlement of Lubrak at the top and the road which gets flooded every monsoon. So Lubrak has been derived from its Tibetan name, Ludak, which is a reference to certain deities who are believed to live beneath the rock cliffs that lie opposite to the settlement. The cliff are striations from the submarine era of the Himalayas that look like the hood of the scales, that look like hood scales of a snake, thereby giving its name. The establishment of Lubrak narrates the story of its founder, Lama Trashi Gelchen, a born priest from eastern Tibet, who made his journey to Mustang in 12th century. Upon reaching Kagbeni, the Lama was informed of a pair of demons that plagued the valley, notorious for devouring humans and animals. Lama Gelchen sought for the demons and subdued them with his powers. Afterwards, he had planted 2 needles on the ground with a prophecy that a sprouting of a tree from the needles would indicate an establishment of a born settlement there. A walnut tree is said to have sprouted from the needles, which now stands at the base of the village. He later meditated in the cave above the village for 9 years, around which a monastery was established later. This is the walnut tree. Kagbeni, on the other hand, it's a 15th century settlement made by the noble families of Lo. It was the center to sword trade, and it is linked to the story of Lubrak. After the demons were subdued, Kagbeni was formed from 2 older neighboring settlements. And as you might know, it's a religious site because of confluence of Kalagandiki and Zongkola. So it sees a significant number of Hindu tourists from India and Nepal. Coming to findings now. Lubrak had a chronic fear of monsoon due to accumulated trauma from repeated exposure. Kagbeni, on the other hand, experienced shock and disbelief as the flood of that scale was unexpected, unknown, unseen. And there was significant grief due to the loss of personal belongings and homes. The quote below was in a conversation with an old woman who shared that loss of sense of order related to ice in the flood debris in Lubrak, which contradicted their local understandings, and the booming sound of flood at night that intensified anxiety. Kagbeni, on the other hand, the flood had occurred in the evening and throughout the night, so people had to run onto the surrounding hills. And it was a night of chaos and confusion, heightened anticipation and uncertainty. And the outburst flood contradicted community's expectation of a typical seasonal flood. In terms of loss of self-determination, in Lubrak, it had to do with consistent failed adaptation efforts, which were the cabin walls, and which had led to loss of self-determination. There were denied petitions to relocations because of lack of land record documents. And there was a deep sense of powerlessness and abandonment as they faced floods every year, but the government had consistently neglected them. Kagbeni, on the other hand, people they expressed frustration over historical marginalization of Mustang, wherein their identity was questioned and exclusion from, they felt that they were excluded from state's protection. So both the places, in both the places, the landscape resembled concretized sediments and boulders, and people could no longer recognize their ancestral lands. So Lubrak had conceded much of their ancestral lands to the river, losing their homes, fields, and sacred sites. Though floods have been a common occurrence in Lubrak's history, the community has noted an increasing intensity and frequency in the last decade. The resulting change has been a 12-meter increase in the elevation of the riverbed in the last decade itself. It has changed the imagination and memories people held with the landscape, with most expressing soulstalgia, which refers to grief and distress when one's home environment is no longer recognizable. Moreover, all the houses in Lubrak stack upon each other along the slope, and the main village stands as a unit, with each house depending on the other for structural and foundational strength. Floods now threaten these ancestral homes, some of which are believed to be here since the foundation of the village. If you look at the pictures above, the yellow line shows the current village boundaries on the right as compared to 2016 on the left. And the blue line on the second set of pictures is a reference to the wall in the past and present times. This was considered even more important as Lubrak is a small priestly born village, and the landscape is intimately tied to their identity and being. And this was a quote shared by an 81-year-old head priest of the village, who has lived through most of these changes and shared how landscape was a connection to his ancestors. He had emphasized that 22 generations of his family had lived here. In Kagbeni, the altered appearance of the village had significant impact on tourism of Kagbeni. They believed that they had lost its aesthetic appeal, and tourists no longer wanted to stay there for longer. A paradise lost was the speech that Ms. Lakshmi Kurun made in COP28 in Dubai, where she was invited to speak on Kagbeni floods. This is how the riverbanks look now as compared to earlier in Kagbeni. And the ex-mayor of Kagbeni shared how tourists reflect on Kagbeni now, stating that it is so unorganized, but that was not necessarily the case. In terms of indirect economic losses and lost opportunities, in Lubrak, the village had already invested a significant amount of their budget on gapping walls, which had buried in a matter of minutes. Otherwise, they believed they could have invested on the development of the village with that money. One person joked when the officials came and asked, "Gapping wall khai ta khannu ani beta hola." Similarly, in Kagbeni, there was significant setback to the development of Kagbeni, affecting the economic growth and limiting the tourism potential. The income from tourism had significantly reduced, with tourism being their primary source of revenue. The long-term implication for the local economy was threatened. Outmigration, in terms of social fabric, outmigration has been a prevalent issue in Mustang, with most of its young population in America, France, or major Nepali cities. But floods seem to have had both positive and negative impact on social cohesion. It improved cohesion among the remnant population, as you can see here in this quote, that in Lubrak, because of the historical understanding of the flood, people do not sit around doing nothing when they have already read the signs. In Kagbeni as well, the whole village got together and created a community kitchen. In the matter of days, people all over Mustang came to help Kagbeni because of its significance. And the translocal communities also helped by raising funds through social media. But at the same time, it did result in displacement of people. So in terms of intolerable loss and the trade-offs that people engage in, for Lubrak, the preservation of the identity was of utmost importance. And there was a strong belief in the prophecy, particularly with Lubrak being the last born village in Mustang. Saving their cultural identity was paramount and tied to the landscape. The religion was central to maintaining their cultural identity, particularly because Lubrak was a priestly clan village. The village could never be left empty, as the gods had to be worshipped every day. The trade-offs that they engaged in was to preserve their cultural identity despite increasing threat of floods. And even though indirect economic losses referred to agricultural losses, but that was acceptable to preserve their identity. This was quite contrasting to Kagbeni, who chose economic self-sustenance based on the river and chose not to move away from the river. Everyone knew that the river was the source of income, and they were unlikely to move away despite all the threats. So yeah, in Kagbeni, intolerable loss was understood in terms of indirect economic impacts from the floods. The devastation had a significant impact on tourism of the village, primarily due to changed sense of place, affecting its ability to attract and retain tourists. Moreover, destruction of religious sites, essential physical infrastructure, including pilgrimage sites, roads, bridges, and utilities, had set back years of gradual development that supported the growing tourism economy. However, people in Kagbeni, it was surprising that people had rebuilt their homes and hotels at the same place where the floods had swept them away. For pilgrims to come to Kagbeni, riverbank was the most essential element, and therefore it did not make sense for them to move away from the river, but focus their efforts on managing the river. So to compare the trade-offs and the intolerable loss that people engaged in, Lubrak's prioritized cultural preservation. The landscape was seen as sacred. Monastery, the walnut tree, meditation sites carried deep spiritual meaning. Leaving meant losing cultural identity, which was thought to be intolerable. The trade-offs that they engaged in was to choose and endure material and environmental loss to preserve culture and place. Physical safety thus was sacrificed for cultural survival. Even though there were adaptive responses, which was to rebuild on high grounds, which was quite autonomous. And the psychological burden persisted due to recurring threats and limited relocation options. So essentially, the case of Lubrak shows limits of adaptation where deep place-based identity resists relocation. Kagbeni, on the other hand, they chose economic security as a core priority. Tourism is the primary livelihood, which depends on religious pilgrims and the value of the confluence. Flood damaged hotels, sites, and infrastructure represented intolerable economic loss. And the trade-off that people engaged in was to rebuild in flood-prone areas to keep income flowing. Acceptable risk, physical risk for short-term economic survival. Pragmatic, but it was potentially maladaptive. The adaptation response herein was focused on restoring tourist infrastructure, and legal land constraints limited options to relocate safely here as well. So Kagbeni's case highlights economic trade-offs under constrained choices, risking future vulnerability. However, psychological toll was significant in both the cases, where in Lubrak it related to cultural grief, spiritual anxiety, and nostalgia from landscape change. Kagbeni was more of emotional fatigue, financial stress, and tension between survival and safety. Now, building on this, I wanted to get on a segue which could be helpful for discussion. Should invisible or intangible dimensions of loss be quantified and monetarily evaluated, given that equity and justice considerations in today's context means delivering funds to these affected communities? Thank you.
कुञ्जजीलाई धन्यवाद। अब चाहिँ हामी खुला छलफलमा जाउँ। एउटा प्रश्न है हुन्छ। तपाईहरुलाई केही सोध्न मन छ भने चाहिँ हात उठाएर संकेत गर्नुहोला।
I need to see this on paper, but it was a little hard to follow your talk because you spent a lot of time building up the analytical framework, but then you're as a simplistic minded historian, I would say your empirical details were too fragmented for me to actually believe on, actually to be convinced that you had an argument. You gave us a long, you spent a lot of time building the framework, but then your empirics were all very disjointed. You gave us blah, 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 81-year-old woman told you this, and then you didn't actually narrativize those quotes. So is that how you've written your stuff, or the writing actually is different from how you present it?
Thank you for the feedback. But yeah, no, the writing is definitely different. It was quite a bit of a challenge to wrap everything because I saw it as a multi-layered process of looking and engaging with loss. So in interest of time, I chose those quotes which could perfectly kind of depict what that aspect of loss meant. Yeah, but like you said, a lot could have been lost in translation.
Other questions?
त्यो कागबेनीको केसको त्यो एउटा सोसल फेब्रिक भनेर भनिरहँदाखेरि चाहिँ ऊ पछि फ्लड पछि उसरी एउटा कमन किचन पनि हुन्न मान्छेहरू त्यसरी एकै ठाउँमा बसेर गयो त्यो चाहिँ त्यहाँको अब कास्ट डाइनामिक्सको हिसाबले कस्तो थियो त्यो कुनै डिस्क्रिमिनेसन त्यहाँ रिफ्लेक्ट भयो भएन भने त्यो एक्सपिरियन्स चाहिँ कस्तो थियो विभिन्न
कास्ट डाइनामिक्सको हिसाबले चाहिँ त्यहाँनिर जुन चाहिँ टिबेटन बुद्धिज्मको आफ्नै हायरार्किज हुन्छ मैले चाहिँ त्यो हायरार्किज त्यति राम्रोसित त्यति बेला बुझ्नु सकिनँ बिकज मैले बुझ्ने हायरार्की चाहिँ हिन्दू कास्ट स्ट्रक्चरबाट थियो अनि त्यहाँभित्र चाहिँ एउटा दुईटा मात्रै दलित फ्यामिलीहरू थियो अब उनीहरूको नेरेटिभ चाहिँ पहिला धेरै जस्तो भेदभाव गर्थ्यो तर यहाँनिर धेरै जस्तो बुद्धिस्टहरू भएकाले खासै हामीले त्यस्तो तल हेर्दैन भनेर चाहिँ एउटा बिलिफ थियो कम्युनिकेसनमा चाहिँ उनीहरू किनभने कम्युनिकेसन चाहिँ त्यो आमा समूहहरूले नै रन गरेको थियो यो आमा समूहहरूमा चाहिँ त्यो दुइटै फ्यामिलीजको वुमेनहरू इक्वली इन्भल्भ थियो सो त्यसमा चाहिँ त्यतिसम्म त्यो डिस्टिङसन चाहिँ थिएन
Thinking about the question you put in your last slide, you mentioned that in one of the picture, the context of Mustang was Nalpariko Jilla, and it was basically a Tibetan region. But also you also put a quote where one woman says that we have always been Nepali. So given that, I think it contradicts a bit. So what is the presence of the government? So when disasters like this happen, so before the humanitarian cause about helping them, so the issue of nationality arises first. So what is your thought on this? Like, Mustang is where there is, I think the presence of government is little अलिकति छैन भनौँ न पकड खालको त्यो स्ट्रङ सो त्यसले गर्दाखेरि त्यहाँ चाहिँ फ्लड आयो अब कम्पेन्सेसनको कुराहरू भन्दा पनि त्यसलाई चाहिँ उनीहरू टिबेटन हो नेपाली होइन भन्ने कुराले उनीहरूको नेसनालिटी नै पहिला अगाडि त्यहाँ आउँछ त्यो कुराहरूलाई चाहिँ कसरी
त्यो चाहिँ उनीहरूले उता मुस्ताङमा चाहिँ कतिवटा इन्सिडेन्सेस भएको रहेछ जहाँनिर गभर्मेन्ट अफिसियल्सहरू आउँदाखेरि यो पनि नेपाल हो जस्तो कुरा गरे रहेछ त्यो ल्यान्डस्केप हेरेर पनि होला मान्छेहरू हेरेर पनि होला तर उनीहरूको त्यो नेरेटिभमै यो नेपालको छुट्टो भाग हो अथवा नेपाल हो कि होइन त्यसमा एउटा प्रिफरेन्स थियो ह्युम्यानिटेरियन रिस्पोन्समा चाहिँ अब सरकारको तर्फबाट कुरा धेरै भयो पुग्यो केही पनि पुग्यो ठ्याक्कै कागबेनीको फ्लड पछि त्यति बेला प्रचण्ड प्राइम मिनिस्टर हुनुहुन्थ्यो उहाँ त्यो कागबेनी नै गएर त्यहाँनिर एउटा स्पिच जस्तो दिनुभएको थियो जहाँनिर उहाँले चाहिँ I forgot the exact number, but I think it was 50 million or something that he quoted. कि त्यति चाहिँ म ग्लोबल क्लाइमेट फन्ड्सहरूबाट कागबेनीलाई नै लिएर आउँछु भनेर भनेको थियो अनि पिपल वर सिटिङ देयर विथ द्याट एक्सपेक्टेसन कि अब यो आउँछ भनेर होइन लाइक इट वाजन्ट जस्ट लोकल पिपल तर इट वाज अल्सो द गभर्मेन्ट अफिसियल्स विदिन मुस्ताङ कि आउँछ भनेको छ आउँछ सो त्यो हिसाबले चाहिँ मुस्ताङको मान्छेहरूले चाहिँ दे डिडन्ट वेट फर द गभर्मेन्ट रिस्पोन्स टु अराइभ बिकज दे डिडन्ट ह्याभ much of expectation and they relied on their own translocal networks. So people from all over the world, Mustangis, they contributed and they sent the money with which they ran the county kitchen. A few of the infrastructure was redeveloped using that same money and they even distributed money to affected families from that same source of funds. So yeah, I mean, have I answered your question?
Yeah, so खालको मुस्ताङ बाहिरको मान्छेलाई पनि चाहिँ मुस्ताङ चाहिँ टिबेटन अटोनोमस रिजन हो भन्ने त्यो छँदा छँदै पनि भित्र मुस्ताङभित्रको मान्छेले पनि त्यसलाई चाहिँ हामीलाई आउँदैन भनेर दे डोन्ट वेट फर द गभर्मेन्टको हेल्प अनि उनीहरू आफ्नो ट्रान्सपोर्टको नेटवर्क युज गरेर सर्ट अफ थिङ्स
That's what they have done then. And they have been in that constant, the question of whether they are treated as Nepali or not is a constant battle which has been like it's historically rooted since the integration of Mustang into Nepal. Okay, if you see where, so here I privately try to question Costco loss burnings, whose losses are accounted for, and it is quite clear in Mustang that losses which happen in Kagbeni, Jomsom, Lomantang, those areas were much more visible rather than any of the offshoot areas because they did not bring any of the significant tourism economy. A lot of these settlements like Jomsom, Kagbeni also lie on the Annapurna circuitको trade groupमा पर्छ. So त्यसले गर्दाखेरि पनि उनीहरूको त्यो consistent revenue generationमा चाहिँ politically there are people who are engaged.
Next. अरू कुनै क्वेसनहरु?
त्यो अब अघि सेन्स अफ प्लेसको कुरा आयो मान्छेहरू एउटा चाहिँ अब सबै त्यहाँ बगाएर लगिसक्यो होइन आफ्नो जग्गा घर लगिसक्यो तैपनि मान्छेलाई त्यो आफ्नो ठाउँप्रति एक खाले चाहिँ हुन्छ होइन अब यहाँ त केही बाँकी नभएपछि अब छोडेर अन्तै माइग्रेट गर्ने हुन्छ अर्को चाहिँ एउटा अब छोड्यो भने त्यो जुन आफ्नो ल्यान्ड पनि पछि आफ्नो नहुन सक्छ भन्ने एक किसिमको फियर पनि हुन्छ अर्को चाहिँ यो आफू यही जन्मे के छोडेर कहाँ जाने भन्ने किसिमको एउटा फिलिङ्स त्यो त्यसप्रतिको त्यो हुन्छ तपाईँले त्यो कस्तो हेर्नुहुन्छ?
त्यो चाहिँ मैले देखेको अलिकति एजमा डिपेन्डेन्ट हुन्थ्यो कि बिकज मुस्ताङको यङ्गर पपुलेसन त त्यहाँ थिएन धेरै जस्तो ओल्डर जेनेरेसन नै थियो अनि उनीहरूलाई चाहिँ आफ्नो ठाउँप्रति लगाव थियो यहीँ हुर्केको जन्मेको त्यो चाहिँ थियो तर कागबेनीमा चाहिँ किनभने योभन्दा अगाडि त्यो स्केलको बारी चाहिँ उनीहरूले भन्थ्यो एटलिस्ट 100 वर्ष जस्तो अगाडि आएको थियो होला हामी सानो हुँदाखेरि हाम्रो आमाबाहरूले भन्थ्यो सो त्यो हिसाबले चाहिँ जब कागबेनीमा जुन चाहिँ त्यो सेन्स अफ प्लेस पुरा चेन्ज भएको थियो त्यसले गर्दाखेरि यहाँनिर उनीहरूले टुरिस्ट यता आएर किन बस्छ त जस्तो एउटा फिलिङ चाहिँ थियो लुब्रामा चाहिँ उनीहरूको पुरा ल्यान्डस्केपमै डिफ्रेन्ट सिक्रेट साइट्सहरू थियो भने अब उनीहरूले अब यस्तै ताल हो भने त हाम्रो गाउँ नै यहाँ हुँदैन हामी को हुन्छ भोलिको दिनमा आएर काठमाडौँ बस्नु पर्ला अब काठमाडौँ बस्यो भने चाहिँ हाम्रो एउटा कल्चरल आइडेन्टिटी र प्र्याक्टिस यतिकै हराउँदै जान्छ किनभने त्यो सबै त गाउँसँग रिलेटेड थियो त्यसरी हराउँदै जान्छ भनेर भन्नु थियो।
मेरो क्वेसन चाहिँ ठ्याक्कै तपाईँसँग नमिल्न पनि सक्छ तर धेरै ठाउँहरूमा चाहिँ बाहिरबाट गएकोहरूले त्यहाँ चाहिँ इन्भेस्ट गर्ने चलनहरू हुन्छ होइन जस्तो त्यहीँको भन्दा नि अरू ठाउँबाट यो कागबेनी वरिपरिको ठाउँमा चाहिँ मुस्ताङभन्दा बाहिरको व्यक्ति गएर त्यस्तो इन्भेस्ट गर्ने होटलको लागि अरूको लागि केही त्यस्तो छ छैन? त्यो चाहिँ मैले किन पनि सोधेको भने यस्तो कल्चरल लस चाहिँ अब नयाँ मान्छे नयाँ ठाउँमा पुग्यो भने चाहिँ उसले त्यो धेरै कुराहरू आफ्नै तरिकाले सोच्ने भयो त्यहाँको भन्दा पनि
एउटा दुईटै रिलेटेड छ एउटामा त्यसमा नि तपाईँ कागबेनीमा जुन चाहिँ तपाईँले भन्नुभयो घरहरू व्यवस्थित भयो अनि अब त्यो छोडेर भने अन्त घरै जग्गै जान्छ त्यति बेला चाहिँ कागबेनीमा धेरै जस्तो धनीहरू थियो होइन उनीहरूको अलरेडी काठमाडौँ पोखरातिर घर थियो अब उनीहरूले त्यो घर फेरि त्यहीँनिर बनाउने जहाँनिर बालीको सम्भावना फेरि हुनसक्छ अथवा बरु जहाँनिर अलिकति बेसी सिक्योर छ त्यहीँतिर सर्ने जस्तो अनि धेरै जस्तो जसले सक्थ्यो उनीहरू सर्यो अनि त्यही हिसाबमा चाहिँ जुन चाहिँ हजुरले भन्नुभयो कि बाहिरको मान्छेहरू कति आएको छ भनेर त्यतिसम्म धेरै जस्तो मैले भेटाएको चाहिँ कागबेनीकै मान्छेहरूले मनालीहरूलाई धेरै स्वापेर गएको हिँडेको थियो सो धेरैवटा कागबेनीमा चाहिँ धेरै उहाँहरूले भन्थ्यो कि खास कागबेनीको मान्छेहरू छैन सरी मनाली उता डोल्पोबाट धेरै मान्छे आएर उनीहरूले चाहिँ उनीहरूलाई तिमी हेर गरी खाऊ, होटल पनि हेरिदियो, घर पनि हेरिदियो, खेतबारी पनि हेरिदियो भनेर धेरैजना चाहिँ त्यसरी हिँडेको थियो।
त्यस्तो त्यहाँ चाहिँ अब त्यो फ्लड आइसकेपछि चाहिँ त्यो कम्युनिटीमा हुने भयो। अझ कम्युनिटी भन्दा पनि एउटा फ्यामिली लेभलमा चाहिँ हेर्दाखेरि चाहिँ यस्तो खालको फ्लड अनि त्यो लसेसले होइन त्यो कम्युनिटीभित्रको फ्यामिलीभित्रको रिलेसनसिप होइन त्यो त्यसमा चाहिँ तपाईँले कुनै यस्तो इम्प्याक्ट त्यस्तो चेन्जेस त्यस्तोहरू चाहिँ कतिको हेर्नुभएको थियो भनेको त्यो रिलेसनसिपमा एउटा कुनै एउटा त्यो डिजास्टर आइसकेपछि चाहिँ त्यसले जुन खालको कल्चरल बिलिफहरू जुन खालको फ्यामिली रिलेसनसिप हुन्छ होइन त्यो आइसकेपछि चाहिँ कस्तो खालको चेन्जेसहरू चाहिँ तपाईँले देख्नुभएको थियो कि
फ्यामिली रिलेसनसिप्स भन्दाखेरि अब जो मान्छेहरू त्यहाँ अलरेडी थियो उनीहरूको यङ त बाहिरै थियो। सो उनीहरूले हामी गाउँमा खालि बुढाबुढी हुन् त्यो एउटा नेगेटिभ चाहिँ एउटा सेट नै थियो कि तर बाहिर भएको फाइदा चाहिँ के भयो कि उनीहरूले छिटैमा सोसियल मिडियाको थ्रु छिटैमा फन्ड्स चाहिँ जेनेरेट गर्न सक्यो। अब फ्लड आज आएको छ भने त्यस विदिन अ विक नै कतिवटा फन्ड्सहरू फ्यामिलीजमा अलरेडी पुगिसकेको थियो। सो अन द ग्राउन्ड चाहिँ फ्यामिली र कम्युनिटीमा रिलेसनसिप चाहिँ मोस्टली जस्तो मैले प्रेजेन्टेसन भने अलिक सपोर्टिभ खालि नै थियो किनभने एउटा पर्सेप्सन थियो कि यसले हामी सबैलाई असर लाग्छ अनि हामी सबै सँगै छौँ यसमा भनेर। सो लुब्रामा चाहिँ त्यो नोसन अब लुब्रा सानो गाउँ भयो 14वटा घर मात्रै भयो। सो त्यो नोसन चाहिँ पहिलादेखि नै थियो किनभने उनीहरूले एकअर्काले हेर्थ्यो। कागबेनीमा चाहिँ अब धेरै त्यहाँको मान्छेहरू बाहिर गएपछि पनि तर गाउँलाई प्रोटेक्ट गर्ने मान्छेहरू चाहिँ आउँथ्यो भनौँ।
जुन तपाईँले एस्थेटिक्सको कुरा गर्नुभयो नि त्यो एस्थेटिक्सहरू लसको कुरा गर्नुभयो लाइक त्यसमा चाहिँ मेरो क्वेसन चाहिँ के भन्दा यो गभर्मेन्टको मापदण्ड अनुसार घर बनाउनु पऱ्यो त एस्थेटिक्सहरू लस भएको हो कि अथवा हुन्छ नि अब जुन रिकन्स्ट्रक्सनमा अब हुन्छ नि त्यो मान्छेले आफै अब होइन हामी नयाँ मोडर्न खालको घरहरू बनाऊँ भन्ने खालको त्यो खालको थट हो कि भन्ने चाहिँ मेरो एउटा क्वेसन। अनि अर्को चाहिँ जुन त्यो युवाहरू जो यङ मान्छेहरू जो बाहिर छन् भन्ने कुरा गर्नुभयो नि त होइन उनीहरूको चाहिँ थट्सहरू के छ आफ्नो त्यो पुरानो ठाउँको बारेमा हुन्छ नि लाइक ओल्ड जो गाउँमै बसिरहेको वृद्धहरू भन्दा त अलिक फरक तरिकाले उनीहरूको सेन्स अफ बिलोङिङ सेन्स अफ प्लेसहरू अलिक फरक होला त्यसमा के छ?
सो मोडर्न र ट्रेडिसनल हाउसेस र सेन्स अफ प्लेसको जुन चाहिँ र एस्थेटिक्सको कुरा गर्नुभयो अब एउटा डाइरेक्टली इम्प्याक्टेड चाहिँ भनौँ न हाउसेस मात्रै होइन कि पुरा ल्यान्डस्केपै चेन्ज भएको छ कि त्यो ल्यान्डस्केप ड्रास्टिकली चेन्ज भएको छ अनि पिपल कुड नो लङ्गर एसोसिएट विथ द्याट ल्यान्डस्केप। मोडर्न र ट्रेडिसनल हाउसेसको फ्लडसँग अलिकति कम आयो इन द सेन्स कि अब जुन चाहिँ नयाँ घर बनाउने धेरैहरूले धेरै जस्तो अफकोर्स कङ्क्रिटको घर बनाउने तर यो फ्लड भन्दा पनि त्यहाँ चाहिँ केसमा बेसी देखियो भने कि मुस्ताङमा चाहिँ रेनफलको इन्टेन्सिटी धेरै नै बढिरहेको छ। त्यो बढेको क्रममा चाहिँ त्यहाँको जुन चाहिँ ट्रेडिसनल हाउसेस थियो माटो र ढुङ्गाको घरहरू सो तिनीहरू धेरै रूपमा भत्किनु थालिसकेको अनि त्यसले गर्दाखेरि पनि मान्छेहरूले चाहिँ अब कङ्क्रिटकै बनाउने भनेर भनेको थियो। तर एट द सेम टाइम देयर वर पिपल जसले चाहिँ मुस्ताङ त ढुङ्गा र माटोको ठाउँ हो होइन यो कङ्क्रिट चाहिँ यहाँबाट आउँदैन भनेर त्यो एउटा रिजनमेन्ट चाहिँ थियो। तर अब विथ द इन्क्रिजिङ भनौँ न क्लाइमेट चेन्ज कन्टेक्स्ट जुन चाहिँ त्यहाँनिर मुस्ताङमा झन् पानी पर्ने क्रम बढ्दै जान्छ भनेर भनेको छ त्यो माटोको घर चाहिँ अलिकति च्यालेन्जिङ नै हुन्छ होला जस्तो लाग्छ मलाई। अनि जुन चाहिँ मुस्ताङीहरू जो बाहिर मुस्ताङबाट बाहिर थियो तर उनीहरूसँग चाहिँ मैले इन्गेज गर्नु सकिनँ। तर जो युथहरू एक दुईजना थियो जो गाउँमै थियो उनीहरूले चाहिँ उनीहरूको धेरैवटा साथीभाइहरू बाहिर गइसकेको थियो। अब उनीहरूले सबै चाहिँ पैसा कमाउनु बाहिर गयो भन्ने एउटा पर्सेप्सन थियो। अब जुन मान्छेहरू त्यहीँनिर थियो उनीहरूले चाहिँ हामी यहीँ गरी खाउँला, यहीँ गरौँला, यो हाम्रो ठाउँमा हामी छोड्दैनौँ, the typical negative. But yeah, I was not able to engage with people outside of Mustang.
I was wondering what's your own thoughts on the slide you have there, because के भन्नु खोजेको भन्दाखेरि चाहिँ basically the state of the government after a major disaster, particularly in our case in the most recent history 2015 earthquakes, it speaks in a particular language of reconstruction, right? But as an academic researcher, you don't need to actually even pay much attention to that. If you're interested in invisible losses, you can actually, there's a whole entire world of literature or practitioners of academic practitioners out there and other practitioners in the non-academic mode who've probably written tons of work on this. I mean, you could situate your own analysis in that world and not give a shit about what the government is saying. You know? So, but those who were affected by this particular disaster could play both games. They could say, paisa linako lagi, they could say, okay, we want to quantify our loss. But that's for a particular strategy, and this they're quite legitimate to do that. But in emotional terms, they could also be suffering from a massive load of invisible losses, through which they try to come to terms with that in everyday existence. I think the person who knows a lot of this, Amish ji, is choosing to be quiet today. So I'm going to be asking a question on his behalf, or not on his behalf, but to provoke him. But the point is this, right? I mean, I'm a historian. I know that lots of, in the last 800 years, our historical record is very sparse. For Mustang, it's probably even sparser than, it's definitely sparser than the Kathmandu Valley. So, one thing is for all our analysis these days to hook up with climate change and say climate change ko karanle yo huna lacha. But once you bring that sparse historical record into that discussion, I think the first question we always need to ask ourselves as analysts is that maybe the climate change story, or if our effort to hook our analysis to the climate change story is too quick, we need to stop and say, maybe since we don't know enough about what has happened in not only Mustang, but in the much better known, let's say, Pokhara area, over the last 800 years, right now, everything attributed to climate change is probably a haste. I'm not being climate skeptic, right? Climate change skeptic. I'm just saying, let's just use caution. Otherwise, Kagbeni 15th century settlement, 5 centuries of documented history, I am sure your level of disaster, level of disaster, people have rebuilt their lives and settlements. I think the crucial difference that we're encountering today is what he was trying to hint at, as people are not returning to the areas in which they grew up. In the way in which 100 years ago or even 75 years ago people were doing that. And we are like globalization, तर त्यो रिजनरेसनको पोसिबिलिटी चाहिँ अरू कारणले चाहिँ अहिले हामीले गर्न नसक्ने देखिसकेको हुनाले चाहिँ हामीले क्लाइमेट चेन्जको स्टोरी र इन्भिजिबल लसको कुरालाई चाहिँ अलि बढी हिस्सै प्रेजेन्टको गरिरहेको हुँ कि भन्ने मनमा अब यस्तो गफ म धेरै सुनिरहन्छु अनि त्यो गफ सुन्दाखेरि मेरो मनमा चाहिँ सधैँ यो कुरा आउँछ हैन अब अमिश दिदी बोल्नुहुन्छ
I actually don't know about this.
No, I completely agree. So, there's this tendency, particularly in Nepal, to associate everything with climate change. And that is, of course, very problematic. What that masks is how we've been cultivating development in this area. So, with even though, like you said, Kagbeni त्यस्तो अरू पनि धेरै इन्स्टेन्सेस भएको थियो होला हिस्ट्रीमा
थाहा छैन मलाई हुनसक्छ कि
हुनसक्छ अफकोर्स त्यहाँ छ पनि एक दुईवटा इन्स्टेन्सेस छ पनि बट द टेन्डेन्सी फर पिपल अलवेज हेज बिन टु रिबिल्ड वेयर एभर दे आर एन्ड एज यु एन्ड द्याट्स द लङ्गर ट्रेन्ड इन नेपाल कि people do not want to come to the place of origin for whatever reasons, for a globalized life. But in terms of like whether these things should be quantified or not, this question itself came from like one sentence with one conversation with a person in Lubrak. मैले चाहिँ उहाँले सोधेको थिएँ कि यो सबै कुराहरू तपाईँले मूल्याङ्कन गर्न सक्नुहुन्छ कि हुँदैन अनि उहाँले भन्नुभयो कि गर्नु त सकिन्थ्यो पैसा दिने कोही छैन भनेर भन्नुभयो अब एन्ड विच again comes to the logic that in how I see it is in current capitalized context in Nepal, some money is better than nothing, of course. So the risk that I see with that is, where we have high rates of unemployment and people are striving for cash, is that going to risk a lot of things, like how our गर्ने कसरीको कुरा आउँछ नि it could be a people it also relates to people who've had a lot of money throughout their lives versus someone who's not seen so much of money in their lives, so they're going to value these things very differently. So
just I one of the things that I'm trying to write more about is the 1950s, right? So 1950s ma tapaile hernu bhayo bhane across the board you can find many people who had very little trust on the state doing anything. They had come of age in the late Rana period and they knew about the limitations of the state. I think we're going through cycles and cycles of that. Even अहिले तपाईँले जुन कोड भन्नुभयो नि आफ्टर डिजास्टर हामीलाई सरकारले केही गरिदिन्छ भने आश छैन, त्यस कारण हामीले नै इन्टरनेसनली हाम्रो कम्युनिटीको रिसोर्सेस मोबिलाइज गरेर रिबिल्ड गर्दैछौँ भन्ने I mean we've seen in the last 75 years alone we've seen many cycles of that happening. And I think the basic distrust of the state being capable enough to actually build people's lives. अहिले हाम्रो रेमिटेन्सले धानेको इकोनोमी भन्छ नि why are Nepalis now living much longer than when I was a kid? It's the private money that people are now using to access better healthcare facilities. At a bottom level भनौँ न त्यो पनि यस्तै खालको कथा हो नि त भन्नु खोजेको के भन्दाखेरि चाहिँ we could analytically separate these domains saying यो पैसा चाहिने कुरामा चाहिँ स्टेटसँग इन्गेज गर्नको लागि चाहिँ people can be quite smooth operator and say okay हाम्रो लसलाई पनि मोनिटाइज गरौँ तर there could be domains of their lives in which they want to deal with their loss, invisible loss, in their only very private and community ways in which money is probably not very significant. I
completely agree. Like I said, how I foresee this is because the government of Nepal is also pushing for loss and damage internationally. They're trying to bring in funds from responding to loss and damage. So अहिले चाहिँ एउटा पुरा एफर्ट गरिरहेछ मेलम्चीको केसमा बनाउनु. So मेलम्चीको इकोनोमिक र नन इकोनोमिक एस्पेक्टमा अब the problem where I see is that your loss and damage discourse जति पनि shape भएको छ at the international level, it's done by economists. So they've gone down to cost-benefit analysis, even in terms of how you deal with non-economic losses. So like I said, then again, how those values again rely on expert judgment. So कोही काठमाडौँमा बसेको कोही एक्सपर्टले उसले भन्छ ल यसले यति तोकिदिन्छ. So that's how I foresee things happening over here because किनभने पैसाको खाँचो छ अनि धेरै खाँचो छ अब त्यसको लागि because Nepalis have always been very adaptive in terms of and resourceful जहाँसम्म जे गर्न सक्छ त्यो त गरेकै छ.
पहिला त प्रतिष्ठाले भनेकोमा एउटा इन्ट्रेस्टिङ द थिङ अबाउट यु आस्किङ मी होइन we have added to what you were saying also. Let's say impact power, right? Let's say some natural disaster happens and people decide to move elsewhere, right? Number one, this is a question for you also, is that how would you consider, let's say, and we've seen this in Mustang multiple times, right? Trans-Himalayan communities, basically you shift communities, Samjang right? So त्यसमा चाहिँ how would you see, let's say, invisible loss भन्ने यो conceptual argument, होइन? Like how do you, let's say, if you have to measure, let's say, the cost of translocation भन्ने कि migration भन्ने, होइन? अनि तपाईले भनेको चाहिँ अब old history, of course, I think the larger thing is also what it's calling for is to look at it from an interdisciplinary sort of way, right? Let's say if you're saying history ma यस्तो disaster भएको छैन, I think Ramble said that, so, and he had also mentioned that like basically Kag is the result of two settlements getting swept away. Okay? Basically, and the myth basically says that there is a serpent with a head and a tail, and but there is new analysis where there's another spot where an earlier settlement could have existed, and shift. Okay? So again, these are, unless you dig into the archives, I don't think you get a sense of, like, I think there is a record of a massive earthquake in 1505, 1505 which was felt, I think, till Delhi Samabani field. So you have, let's say, corresponding accounts from multiple sources. And the center of that is pretty much Tibet, Himalaya. But beyond that, I don't think any adjoining climate change discipline, let's say, history, archival history, what is the, let's say, response earlier times to, let's say, such disasters? I don't think you saying also.
Yeah, can respond, like we've discussed in our conversations, the day case, like even though people have shifted from there, but that's happened when they were forced at the, they were at the edge and they had no other option than to shift. But yeah, like as you've often mentioned, how they maintain maintain their territorial deities and how they engage with them to indicate that they have not actually left the place, but they're still in that place. In Unarako cost of translocation, kasari garne no clue. But at the same time, like what is beneficial, at least from climate change literature, is the loss management. Some losses are bound to happen regardless. So that's what the adaptation limit is. So adaptation limit is beyond which people have no other choice than to accept what's happening. So in the literature, what they've suggested is there should be ways how, as Southasia he mentioned, like how people and communities by themselves engage in accepting those laws. That would have to be done, but it's just that just because loss and damage discourse, loss and damage like paisa, that does not necessarily translate that everything can be saved. I think,
I just had a comment, and so this thing, it was a disaster, a disaster or a climate disaster, two different aspects. Of a climate disaster, what I took from one of your comments earlier was that the earthquake, the rainfall is more, it's changing, and these kind of houses may not sustain over time. So that is almost like more regularity. Whereas with other kinds of disasters, be it earthquake, be it those big cyclical floods or whatever, that happens once in a while. So this thing of more rapid kind of disasters. So, and this particular story is like, how does a community or communities who are very unique and what, very small, very unique, very culturally, introverted in whatever they do, how do they sustain their way of life? the whole cycle of not just economics, but the culture, the way of life. So I think for this, that's what really hits me. It could be any disaster, but this is something that's happening more and more often. That is the real, borderline. That's what I say.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I do agree that things like earthquake, like you said, happens once in a while, and I think the more critical factor in this is that this is situated in a whole global discourse. I think what also this and why we are actually talking about this is because people and there are talks on it in the international level, and everything is surrounding money in the climate change discourse now. So the question is whether, what are the different ways to look at and perceive these things, and whether everything can be monetized or not.
अरू प्रश्नहरू केही छन् भने हामीले एउटा लिन सक्छौँ, एउटा दुईटा छैन भने चाहिँ हामी औपचारिक रूपमै कार्यक्रम सकौँ। क्वेसन छैन। कुञ्जजीलाई हामी धेरै धेरै धन्यवाद दियौँ, किनभने उहाँको कुरा सुन्न पनि पाइयो अनि हामी भेटघाट गर्न पनि पाइयो। अब हामी इन्फर्मल रूपमा चाहिँ गफ गर्न सकिहाल्छौँ, फर्मल रूपमा यही कार्यक्रम सिध्याउँ। आउने कार्यक्रम चाहिँ मङ्गलबार रामप्रसाद धिताल, उहाँ चाहिँ विद्युत नियमन आयोगबाट बोल्दै हुनुहुन्छ। कुञ्जजीलाई धन्यवाद।